It was a typical Friday night, and after a long week at work, I was eager to unwind with some gaming. I had just settled into my favorite spot on the couch, the glow of the TV casting a warm light in the otherwise dim room. I put on my headphones, immersed in the world of virtual battles, completely oblivious to the world around me. As the hours passed, I lost track of time. My focus was solely on the game, defeating enemies, leveling up my character, and engaging in heated online matches with friends. The sounds of gunfire and explosions drowned out everything else, creating a bubble of excitement that felt impenetrable. It wasn't long until I took a break to go grab a drink that I noticed that something was off. The house felt unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the intense gaming session. I stepped into the kitchen, filled my glass, and returned to the living room, ready to dive back into the action. But as I settled in, I caught a glimpse of movement outside my window. I paused, my heart racing as I squinted into the darkness. I saw nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. I resumed my game, trying to shake off the unease. Then, the feeling of being watched began to creep in. I couldn't pinpoint it, but something felt wrong. I dismissed it again and focused on my screen, but the nagging sensation wouldn't go away. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But the only company I had was my gaming console and the flickering screen. After a particularly intense match, I leaned back, stretching my arms and letting out a sigh of relief. That's when I noticed the back door, which I always kept locked. It was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip through unnoticed. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked it before I started playing. Panic set in, and I quickly muted my game. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the console. I listened intently, straining to hear any sound that might indicate an intruder. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, slowly approaching the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard a faint creak behind me. I turned, adrenaline surging through me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the air felt charged with tension. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help if I needed to. But before I could do anything, I heard what sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving through the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel their presence. I was not alone. I glanced at the window, the streetlights casting just enough light to see outside. I considered making a run for it, but the thought of encountering whoever was inside paralyzed me. With shaky hands, I dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I whispered my situation. "I think someone has broken into my house," I said, barely above a whisper. The operator assured me help was on the way. I felt a flicker of hope, but the fear was overwhelming. I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, as if someone was moving through the rooms, searching. My heart raced as I ducked behind the couch, clutching my phone tightly. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, and I knew I had to stay quiet, stay hidden. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I waited, counting the seconds that felt like hours. I could hear nothing but the quiet hum of the night and the distant wail of sirens approaching. I dared to peek out from behind the couch, but the room was empty. When the police arrived, I rushed to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. They searched the house, and I followed closely behind, scared and anxious. They found no one. No signs of a break-in, except for the door that I had left ajar. After questioning me and reassuring me that I was safe, they left. I stood in the middle of my living room, still shaken, and turned back to my gaming setup. It was then that I noticed something on the floor. A small piece of paper just outside my field of vision. I bent down and picked it up, realizing it was a small note that read, "Good game." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been in my home, watching me, while I remained blissfully unaware, lost in my game. I felt sick, the adrenaline draining from my body, leaving me trembling. I locked the door and every window, my heart still racing as I sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on me. From that day on, I never played games alone at night again. The thrill of the virtual world was overshadowed by the haunting knowledge that in the quiet moments, real danger could be lurking just behind the shadows. About a month ago, my 5-year-old son Luke became obsessed with an old teddy bear. It was falling apart, one eye missing, stuffing leaking out, but he refused to let it go. He called it Mr. Bear, though he never named it before. My wife and I decided to throw it away while Luke slept. The next morning, he woke up frantic. "Where's Mr. Bear?" He screamed, terrified. It wasn't just a normal tantrum. Luke was pale, shaking like something terrible had happened. He kept saying, "I have to find him. He'll be mad at me." That night, things escalated. Luke didn't sleep. He started whispering to someone, pointing at the closet and saying, "He's here." I found him, wide-eyed and sweating, clutching the bear's old ribbon. I know I threw that bear away, but the ribbon was back, dirty and frayed, wrapped tight around his little hands. I tried to take it, but Luke screamed, "Don't! He's watching!" Later that night, I woke up to scratching. I thought it was the wind, but the sound was coming from under my bed. I leaned over, heart pounding, and saw a hand. Long, pale fingers with jagged nails, reaching out from beneath the bed. Before I could move, it grabbed my ankle, ice cold and sharp. I've never felt anything so cold in my life. At least, not anything living. I yanked free, pulling Luke into my arms. Clutching each other's hands, we ran for the door, but as we reached it, something slammed against it from the other side, hard. The door rattled, deep breathing echoed through the room, and the claws scraped against the wood. There was something so intense about the scratching, like whatever was doing it would stop at nothing until it broke through. I turned to Luke, but he wasn't scared anymore. His face was blank. "You shouldn't have thrown him away," he whispered. The scratching stopped. I finally opened the door, pulling Luke out of the room. We stayed in the living room that night. I didn't sleep. The house was quiet, but I could still feel it. Him watching. The next morning, Luke was different. He just sat in his room, holding the bear's ribbon. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'll bring him back." And then I noticed it. Dark, wet dirt scattered across the floor, leading from the bed to the closet. Luke looked up at me, his eyes dark, hollow. He squeezed the ribbon tightly in his fist. "You can't stop him," he said, his voice cold. "Mr. Bear's coming for you." I'm writing this from my study. The house is quiet now. Too quiet. Luke hasn't made a sound in hours, and I'm too scared to check on him. The ribbon, dirt, the hand. I can still feel the cold grip on my ankle. I've locked myself in here hoping it'll be enough, but deep down, I know it won't be. The scratching has started again. Faint at first, but it's growing louder. I hear it coming from under the door, and I know what's next. There's no escape. I threw him away, and now he's coming for me. I've never been one to really talk to girls. I've always been afraid of them. I was always afraid of rejection. I was afraid of being made fun of. I was just afraid of girls. There were only two women that I could actually talk to during my childhood, them being my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother died when I was very young. She was diagnosed with lung cancer and later Alzheimer's with dementia and died at the age of 73. I remember her house, across the street from my own, having the same dingy and disgusting vibe as the bowling alley from my previous post. She smelled horrible, and to be honest, she didn't look much better. But I loved her, as much as any boy can love a grandma. For the longest time, she was my rock, the one who would hold me when I cried and lifted me when I felt encouraged. She made sure that every need that I ever had was met and exceeded. She instilled in me the values of a good person, to accept people no matter how different they are from me. She was the pinnacle of humanity for the most part. For a long time, if I wasn't at Corbin's house or camping, I was at my grandmother's house, ingesting as much secondhand smoke as I possibly could. It likely shortened my life by years for spending so much time there, but I don't care. She would have me over for dinner all the time, and it was always the best tasting thing I ever had. She even invited me and Corbin over to her house for sleepovers when Mom had to work overnights. She was absolutely amazing. That all ended very suddenly. Her death hurt me more than almost anything. More than my dog running away and dying. Even more than my father dying. There was only one event that affected me more than the untimely death of my grandmother, and I will be covering that at some point later. I remember seeing a closed casket at her viewing, wondering what expression she would be left with for the rest of time. I never got to find out. I remember being at the funeral wondering if that was even my grandmother in the casket at all. I thought it was a sick prank, that she would show up again. But she never did. She was dead. In the months and years leading up to her death, she became very ill. She would spend days or even weeks in the hospital having radiation pumped into her veins. She looked so frail and weak that I was scared to even touch her, let alone hug her when we left her side. I would walk into the room thinking that she would be dead when we arrived, but she was always there. She fought hard. It's not fair that cancer had to make it a draw. It should have shown her some mercy. My mother told me this many days after prodding. She's tired of my constant questions, but I deserve answers. My grandma came home for the last time, and this would be the last time I saw her. In her final weeks, she had a rapid mental decline. The trauma of chemotherapy and this horrible disease took a huge toll on her mind. It was like talking to a totally different person. She was a total shell of her former self. It was like talking to a stranger. Even in this mental state, we would still spend the night at her house. When the window tapping would happen, she would freak out and scream hysterically, as she should have. Seconds later, she would forget about it. When I slept at my grandma's house when she was sick, I would wake up in a different place than where I remember falling asleep. It was so quiet in that house that I could hear my heartbeat. It sounded like thudding footsteps. I would fall asleep, hear my heartbeat, and wake up in a new room. I would always assume that maybe my grandmother was moving me, but I never asked her. She would not have had an answer anyway. I thought maybe I was sleepwalking, and I'm not sure. There was one night I remember vividly. It was one of the worst nights of my life. Corbin and I went over to my grandmother's house to sleep over like we tended to do when my mother worked long days. The day overall was very strange. I felt a mongering feeling of being watched closely. Like, really closely. Corbin said that it was nothing, and that I needed to relax, and I believed him. I went on with my day, still feeling uneasy about seemingly nothing, and eventually fell asleep that night. As usual, there was a tap on my window. Tap, tap, tap. This time, there was a man standing outside of my window, staring in at me. Just a blank and expressionless stare. I screamed. Corbin woke up, turned on the light, and the man was gone. It was as if he never existed or had ever even been there. Corbin tried comforting me without any sort of success. I was in absolute hysterics. We went back to sleep. The window taps started again. Tap, tap, tap. And again, the man was standing outside our window. And again, I screamed. I screamed bloody murder. Corbin woke up again, turned on the light, and the man was gone again. He tried to comfort me the best that he could, saying that the man wasn't there and that it was just best that I go to bed. My grandmother woke up and rushed into our room just to make sure we were okay. We told her what happened, and she said that we were probably just dreaming and that we shouldn't focus on it and go back to sleep. Through all of this, she was calling us the wrong names. I could not go back to sleep. That man was going to get me if I fell asleep. I just knew it. I tried hard to stay awake all night, but as a little boy, that is near impossible. Even with how hard I fought it, I fell asleep. The heartbeats I heard that night were loud. It sounded like a full-on elephant stampede. I woke up the next morning, and everything was normal. I woke up in the same place I fell asleep at. Corbin was there, and Grandma was in the kitchen making breakfast. Everything was okay. I asked my grandmother about what had happened the night before, and she said she couldn't remember anything. The rest of the day was completely normal. Corbin and I played outside for a while, and we watched way too much TV when we were not outside. We ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and eventually went back to my house because my mother was home. We said goodbye to my grandmother for what was unknowingly the last time. That night, I didn't hear the window tapping. I heard the sound of a tap on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. I woke up, and the man was not outside my window this time. He was inside my room. The man made it inside of my house. I kicked and screamed and cried violently. He grabbed me and picked me up, forcing a rag into my mouth. I remember his hands being cold and wet. I passed out. Hours later, I woke up dazed and confused. I was no longer in my house. I was at my grandmother's house. I got up and saw one of the most grisly and disgusting scenes imaginable. The walls were painted in a disgusting red with piles of meat all over the place. The bed was stained and the hardwood floors were soaked in blood. Her head was displayed next to the window, facing towards my own window. A face of pain and fear etched into her being forever. I had to get out. I ran around the house trying to find an escape. In my confusion and hysteria, I had forgotten the layout of the house and ended up going in circles. The whole house was bloody. It was abhorrent. I finally made my way to the back door. I ran out and ran over to my house. I was completely barefoot. My left foot was cut by a piece of glass that was laying by where the window of my grandmother's house had been broken. It was bleeding uncontrollably. I made it to my front door, pounded it hard until my mother answered. I was screaming and crying uncontrollably. When my mother opened the door, I clung right to her. I told her everything that I had seen. I told her about the man in the house. I told her about the disgusting scene at my grandmother's house. I told her everything. She hugged me for several minutes, crying and saying that everything will be okay. Once she was finally able to let go of me, she ran to the kitchen to call the police. After a few minutes, they finally showed up. She met them over at grandmother's house, and by the expression on their faces, they had never seen anything like what was waiting for them in that house. Many of them cried. Some vomited. There was one man who was so distraught at what he saw that it led him to take his own life later. I watched them take her out in bags. I miss her more than anything. I hope that I can bring justice to her and punish the thing who has been torturing me all of my life. As for now, that is all I have for you. I'm going to try to talk to my mother again, but I can't make any promises. She thought that I had forgot about all of this, and it's hurting her to have to live through it all again. I just need answers.